Hey guys, welcome to Just Sleep Stories, and tonight we're going somewhere deeply personal. Somewhere that, statistically speaking, at least 3 of you have already been today. We're talking about the strange, desperate, medically questionable world of people who take massive amounts of Imodium. Not the one tablet, follow the directions, sensible people. No. We're talking about the people who look at the recommended dosage on the back of that little green box and say, "That's adorable. Hold my emergency granola bar." So before you get comfortable, well, actually, maybe you should get comfortable first. That seems important tonight. Take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And if you want to share your own Imodium origin story in the comments, I will read every single one, and I will not judge you. Not even a little. Let's pause for a second because there are questions that need asking. Have you ever wondered what it actually feels like when your gut just fully declares war on you in the middle of a Tuesday? What kind of person starts with 1 tablet and ends up taking 6? Is there a specific moment, a gas station sushi decision perhaps, or a "this mayonnaise smells fine" situation, where a person crosses the line from cautious to committed? What happens to a body that has been chemically convinced, against its will, to simply hold on? And has anyone, anywhere, ever read the full warning label on that box and thought, "You know what? I'm going to be fine. Congratulations. You've just woken up with your stomach making a sound that belongs in a nature documentary." The year is irrelevant. The bathroom is very relevant. And someone, somewhere, is already counting their tablets. Good luck. Let's talk about the inciting incident. Because nobody wakes up on a quiet Wednesday morning and thinks, "Today is the day I will absolutely need industrial strength digestive intervention." No, it starts with a decision. A seemingly harmless, entirely avoidable decision. Maybe it was the buffet. Maybe it was the leftovers that had been in the fridge for a day longer than anyone should have allowed. Maybe it was the street food that smelled incredible and tasted even better and seemed totally fine right up until about 90 minutes later, when your body sent you a very firm, very urgent memo. The gastrointestinal system is, medically speaking, a masterpiece of engineering. 25 feet of specialized tubing that processes everything you eat with quiet, dignified efficiency. Until it doesn't. Until something tips the balance, floods the system with fluid, fires the whole mechanism into fast forward, and suddenly you're not a person with plans anymore. You're a person with one plan, and it is very immediate. What triggers it? The list is long, and most of it is embarrassing in retrospect. Bacterial contamination is one of the most common culprits. Food that has been handled improperly, stored at the wrong temperature, or prepared in conditions that would make a health inspector weep quietly into their clipboard. The bacteria most frequently responsible include Escherichia coli, Salmonella, Campylobacter, and Staphylococcus aureus, which produces toxins so fast-acting that symptoms can begin within 1 to 6 hours of eating contaminated food. That is not a lot of runway. That is barely enough time to get home from the restaurant. Viruses are the other major player. Norovirus, the so-called stomach bug that spreads through schools, cruise ships and office buildings with the efficiency of a very motivated rumour, is responsible for an estimated 585 million cases of gastroenteritis globally every year. It requires an absurdly small infectious dose, meaning you don't need to eat a lot of contaminated food to get sick. You need to eat almost none of it. A microscopic quantity on a contaminated surface, transferred to your mouth without your knowing, is sufficient. Norovirus is essentially the overachiever of gastrointestinal pathogens. Technically impressive, profoundly unwelcome. Then there are the non-infectious triggers, which are less dramatic but equally inconvenient. Certain medications cause diarrhea as a side effect, including antibiotics, metformin, some blood pressure drugs, and antacids containing magnesium. Dietary choices play a significant role. Large amounts of fructose, sorbitol found in sugar-free products, or caffeine can overwhelm the gut's absorptive capacity and produce loose stools with remarkable reliability. Lactose intolerance, affecting roughly 65% of the global adult population to some degree, means that a glass of milk or a generous serving of cheese is a gamble, with known odds that some people continue to take anyway, every single time, with an optimism that is either admirable or baffling depending on your perspective. And then there is stress. The gut has its own nervous system, the enteric nervous system, which communicates constantly with the brain and responds to psychological states in ways that are inconvenient, scientifically fascinating, and deeply annoying when you have somewhere to be. A job interview, a difficult conversation, a flight that has already been delayed twice. These are not physical threats. They are perceived threats. And your gut, ancient and unhelpful, cannot always tell the difference. Here is the thing nobody mentions in the moment. Diarrhea, as unpleasant as it is the body doing its job. It is the gut's emergency response system, evacuating contents at speed when it detects something harmful, infectious, or destabilizing. It is not a malfunction, it is a feature running at exactly the wrong time, on exactly the wrong day, with absolutely no regard for your calendar. The inciting incident varies. The result is always the same, and the only question that remains in the breathless aftermath is, do you have Imodium, and how many is too many? Before we get into the chaos, let's meet the product at the centre of tonight's story, loperamide hydrochloride, sold most famously as Imodium, a small white tablet with an enormous reputation and a very specific job. Imodium was first synthesized in the late 1960s by a Belgian pharmaceutical company, and it was approved for over-the-counter use in the United States in 1988, which means it has been quietly sitting in medicine cabinets, airport pharmacies, and the bottom of overstuffed handbags for decades, waiting for its moment. The drug works by binding to opioid receptors in the walls of the intestine, not in the brain at normal doses, which is the important distinction, slowing down the muscular contractions that move everything through the digestive tract. In plain terms, it tells your gut to calm down, slow down, and stop making decisions without consulting anyone. The recommended dose is simple: 2 milligrams to start, 1 milligram after each loose stool, never more than 8 milligrams in 24 hours without physician guidance. 2 milligrams is one standard tablet. The math is not complicated. Most people follow these instructions with the diligence of someone who genuinely does not want to find out what happens if they don't. Loperamide was invented by a chemist named Paul Janssen, a Belgian pharmacologist who was, by any measure, one of the most prolific drug developers in pharmaceutical history. He is credited with developing over 80 marketed drugs during his career, including haloperidol, a major antipsychotic, and fentanyl, a powerful opioid analgesic, two drugs that have had enormous and complicated legacies in medicine. Loperamide was, comparatively, one of his quieter achievements. A targeted peripheral opioid receptor agonist designed specifically to stay in the gut and do its job without wandering upstairs to the brain and causing euphoria, sedation, or any of the other effects associated with systemic opioids. It was elegant engineering for an unglamorous purpose. Before 1988, if you needed loperamide in the United States, you needed a prescription, which meant you needed a doctor, which meant you needed an appointment, which meant that by the time you got the medication, the situation had almost certainly resolved itself one way or another. The transition to over-the-counter availability was significant because it recognized something sensible. Acute diarrhea in otherwise healthy adults is extremely common, generally self-limiting, and does not require a physician to diagnose. You know what it is. You know what you need. Let the person have the tablet. Today, loperamide is available in dozens of countries, sold under various brand names in tablets, capsules, and liquid formulations, and it remains one of the most purchased over-the-counter medications in the world. It sits on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. It is generic, inexpensive, widely available, and for the vast majority of the hundreds of millions of people who use it each year, completely unremarkable. You take it, it works. You move on with your life and pretend the whole thing never happened. The box itself is an underappreciated piece of communication design. It does a lot of work in a small space, conveying dosing instructions, warnings, contraindications, and the quiet suggestion that perhaps 2 days of symptoms is really the maximum you should be managing at home without professional help. Most people read it once, quickly, under conditions of some urgency, and retain approximately 40% of the information. The rest, as they say, is improvised. Here is where things get interesting. The box is very clear. The box has done everything it can. The box has used bold text, bullet points, and what might be described as a quietly pleading tone. And still, there are people who look at that maximum daily dose and decide that the box simply does not understand the gravity of their particular situation. To be fair to these people, there is usually a moment of genuine desperation involved. It is rarely recreational overuse out of idle curiosity. It is usually a person standing in a gas station bathroom in rural Ohio at 6 a.m, mentally calculating whether they can make it to a wedding 2 states away, and deciding that the answer is yes, but only if they make certain pharmaceutical adjustments. The human capacity for optimism is truly remarkable. It shows up most powerfully, it turns out, not in moments of great achievement or romantic love, but in moments where a person looks at a packet of anti-diarrheal tablets and thinks, I'm going to need all of them. Doctors, sensibly, do not recommend this. But doctors are not the ones trying to survive a 7-hour road trip with a nervous stomach and a rental car. Doctors are not the ones facing a 9 o'clock client presentation with a gut that has decided, with terrible timing, to stage an uprising. Doctors are not standing in the hotel bathroom at 5:30 a.m, staring at the box and doing the math. When you're in that situation, the rational part of your brain, the part that reads warning labels and schedules annual checkups, has temporarily handed the wheel to a different department, the department of making this stop immediately by any means available. The maximum recommended over-the-counter dose is 8 milligrams per day for adults managing acute diarrhea without physician supervision. This is 4 standard tablets. It is a reasonable limit designed around the drug's therapeutic window, the range in which it is effective and safe for the general population. At this dose, loperamide does exactly what it's supposed to do: slows gut motility, reduces fluid secretion, and provides meaningful relief within 1 to 3 hours in most people. The problem with exceeding this dose is not that loperamide suddenly stops working, it continues to work. The problem is that at significantly higher doses, the drug's behavior changes in ways that the gut-only mechanism can no longer contain. The body's P-glycoprotein transport system, which actively pumps loperamide back out of the brain before it can accumulate there at normal doses, can be overwhelmed at very high doses, and the heart, which has its own opioid receptors and its own electrical sensitivity, begins to register the excess in ways that are considerably less convenient than the original problem. But all of that is pharmacology, and pharmacology is very difficult to concentrate on when you are calculating travel times and bathroom frequencies in a gas station in rural Ohio. What people experience in that moment is not a risk assessment. It is a negotiation between discomfort and function, between the body and the schedule, between what the box says and what the situation apparently requires. And here is the dry, honest truth of it. Most people who take slightly more than the recommended dose of Imodium are fine, not because exceeding the dose is safe in principle, but because the margin between the therapeutic dose and the dose where serious things begin to happen is wide enough that mild overuse in an otherwise healthy adult rarely produces serious consequences. The body is more forgiving than the label implies. This is both reassuring and dangerous because it means the feedback from mild overuse is almost always positive. It worked. Nothing bad happened. Noted for future reference, which does not help anyone develop a healthy respect for the number on the box. Somewhere in the long and distinguished history of human travel, someone took a bite of something they shouldn't have, smiled because it tasted wonderful, and then spent the next 48 hours deeply regretting every decision that had led them to that meal. Traveller's diarrhea is one of the most common medical complaints among international tourists, affecting somewhere between 20 and 50% of travellers to developing regions, which is a statistic that is both alarming and, if you've ever eaten adventurously abroad, entirely believable. The culprit is most often a bacterium called enterotoxigenic Escherichia coli, a specific and largely harmless travel variety, which thrives in food and water contaminated in ways that local populations have often developed a tolerance to over years of exposure. You, arriving fresh and optimistic from a country with different water treatment standards, have not. Your gut has never met this particular challenge before, and it responds the way anyone would when ambushed, loudly, dramatically, and with absolutely no regard for your travel schedule. The condition has been given many names over the years, most of them reflecting the country where the traveller was when it happened. Montezuma's Revenge in Mexico, Delhi Belly in India, the Pharaoh's Curse in Egypt, the Aztec two-step, which at least makes it sound vaguely like a dance. Each nickname represents thousands of ruined holidays, missed tours, and afternoons spent horizontal in hotel rooms that were supposed to be used for sightseeing. It is a condition so common among travellers that many frequent international travellers simply accept it as part of the experience, the tax levied by adventure on the digestive system. The onset is typically within the first week of travel, most commonly in the first 3 days. Symptoms include loose or watery stools, sometimes 3 or more per day, abdominal cramping, nausea, and an urgency that makes tourist attractions considerably less enjoyable. Most cases resolve within 3 to 5 days without treatment. Most cases. The ones that don't are the ones standing in the airport at departure time, white-knuckling a carry-on and quietly renegotiating their entire relationship with the concept of international travel. Prevention strategies exist and are sensible and widely known and followed with variable consistency. Drink only bottled or treated water. Avoid ice. Eat food that has been thoroughly cooked and is served hot. Avoid raw vegetables, unpeeled fruit, and street food prepared in conditions you cannot verify. This advice is correct and reasonable and also completely incompatible with the actual experience of travelling somewhere interesting, where the best food is almost always the street food. The ice is in everything, and refusing a local specialty offered with genuine hospitality requires a particular kind of commitment that not everyone possesses. This is where the travel Imodium kit enters the story. Experienced travellers carry it the way experienced travellers carry travel insurance, not expecting to use it, but absolutely not leaving home without it. A packet of loperamide, some oral rehydration salts, and possibly a course of antibiotics prescribed by a travel medicine physician before departure. This is the standard preventive toolkit recommended by most travel health clinics. The antibiotics are for bacterial cases that are severe or persistent. The loperamide is for the moments when you need to function. Get on a bus, board a plane, attend the thing you came here to attend without excusing yourself every 20 minutes. It is not glamorous. It is not the travel brochure, but it is the honest version of what exploring the world sometimes costs, paid not in money but in digestive inconvenience, and managed, more often than not, with a small white tablet and a very sincere wish that you'd eaten something different at lunch. Food poisoning and traveller's diarrhea are cousins. They share a family resemblance, a general unpleasantness, and a tendency to arrive at the worst possible moment, but they are not identical. Food poisoning is the broader category caused by any number of bacteria, viruses, parasites, or toxins that enter your system through contaminated food or water. Salmonella, Campylobacter, Listeria, norovirus. The roster reads like a terrible guest list for a party inside your digestive system. What makes food poisoning particularly sneaky is the incubation period, which can range from 30 minutes to several days depending on the pathogen, meaning you often have no idea which meal did it. Was it the sushi, the chicken, the suspiciously warm potato salad at the office party? The mystery is part of the suffering. Not only are you unwell, but you cannot even assign blame with any confidence, which is deeply unsatisfying from a psychological standpoint. In the United States alone, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimates that foodborne illnesses cause approximately 48 million cases of illness each year. 48 million. That is roughly 1 in 7 Americans every single year experiencing some form of food poisoning. It causes an estimated 128,000 hospitalizations and 3,000 deaths annually. It is one of the most common medical experiences in the developed world, and yet it is discussed with considerably less urgency than conditions affecting far fewer people, perhaps because it is embarrassing, perhaps because it is usually brief, or perhaps because assigning it the gravity it deserves would require a very uncomfortable conversation about food safety practices in restaurants, catering operations, and home kitchens that most people would rather not have. The most common bacterial cause in the United States is Campylobacter, followed closely by Salmonella, both typically acquired through undercooked poultry, contaminated produce, or unpasteurized dairy. Staphylococcus aureus is the rapid onset option, producing toxins in food that cause vomiting and diarrhea within 1 to 6 hours, before you've even had time to suspect the meal. Bacillus cereus, found most often in reheated rice left at room temperature, operates on a similarly aggressive timeline and is the reason that the rice sitting on your counter since last night is not the neutral benign leftover it appears to be. Loperamide's role in food poisoning is where the medical nuance lives. For viral gastroenteritis, norovirus, rotavirus, loperamide is generally considered safe and helpful for managing symptoms in adults. For bacterial food poisoning, the picture is more complicated. In cases caused by toxin-producing bacteria, slowing the gut may prolong the duration of illness by reducing the speed at which the offending toxins are expelled. In cases of invasive bacterial infection, where the bacteria are actually penetrating the intestinal wall rather than just irritating it, using an anti-diarrheal agent can increase the risk of serious complications by allowing the organism to accumulate. In these cases, the diarrhea is the treatment, which is one of those sentences that is medically accurate and personally infuriating in equal measure. The practical guidance is this. If you have diarrhea with blood in it, a high fever, severe abdominal pain, or symptoms that are getting worse rather than better, loperamide is not the right first move. Those symptoms suggest something more than straightforward food poisoning, and they deserve medical attention rather than pharmaceutical management at home. If you have standard, uncomplicated, unpleasant acute diarrhea with no alarming features, loperamide is reasonable, effective, and will make the next few hours considerably more manageable. The box in this case is telling the truth, and the truth for once is actually helpful. Not all emergency diarrhea is caused by something you ate. Sometimes the culprit is something you felt, which is either reassuring or deeply inconvenient depending on how philosophical you're prepared to be about the mind-gut connection at 7 in the morning before an important meeting. The gut is sometimes called the second brain, and this is not a metaphor. The enteric nervous system lining your gastrointestinal tract contains roughly 500 million nerve cells and communicates constantly with the brain via the vagus nerve. When the brain perceives stress, it triggers the fight or flight response, which among other things accelerates gut motility as part of a very ancient survival mechanism that presumably made sense when humans needed to be physically lighter to run from predators, but is significantly less useful before a job interview or a first date. The physiological pathway is worth understanding because it makes the whole miserable experience at least intellectually interesting while it is happening to you. When the brain activates the stress response, it triggers the release of corticotropin-releasing factor, which acts on the gut as well as the adrenal glands. It accelerates the movement of contents through the large intestine. It increases intestinal permeability, loosening the tight junctions between intestinal cells, and it alters the secretion of fluid and mucus into the gut. The result is exactly what you would expect from a system that has been put on emergency fast-forward: looser, more frequent stools, cramping, urgency, and the specific, awful sensation of needing a bathroom in a location where bathrooms are not available. This is not a psychological weakness. It is a physiological response with a clear evolutionary logic that has simply failed to keep up with the pace of civilizational change. Your nervous system cannot distinguish between the acute physical threat of a predator and the acute psychological threat of presenting quarterly results to a boardroom full of people who are already skeptical of the numbers. Both register as danger. Both trigger the same cascade. The boardroom does not care about your fight or flight response. Your gut does not care about the boardroom. And there you are, in the middle, trying to manage the negotiation. Chronic stress compounds the picture significantly. People living under sustained psychological pressure, demanding work environments, relationship difficulties, financial anxiety, caregiving responsibilities, often experience persistent gut symptoms that have no identifiable dietary or infectious cause. The gut is running on a low simmer of activation that never fully switches off, producing bloating, cramping, altered bowel habits, and a general digestive unreliability that makes planning anything feel like a gamble. It is the body's way of communicating that something is wrong, which would be more useful if the communication were less inconvenient and more specific. Loperamide works on the physical symptoms of stress-related diarrhea in exactly the same way it works on any other diarrhea, by slowing the gut mechanically, regardless of what caused the acceleration. It does not address the stress. It does not communicate with the vagus nerve or calm the enteric nervous system or reduce the output of corticotropin-releasing factor. It simply slows things down at the intestinal level, buying time and function while the body continues doing whatever the body was doing. For an acute time-limited situation, the presentation, the interview, the flight, this is often exactly sufficient. For a chronic pattern driven by sustained stress, it is a reasonable short-term management tool that works best alongside, and not instead of, addressing the underlying cause. The honest summary: your gut knows when you are stressed. It has always known. It will continue to know. The best you can do most days is acknowledge the communication, take reasonable steps to reduce the source, and keep the Imodium somewhere accessible for the days when acknowledgement alone is not going to be enough. For somewhere between 10 and 15% of the global population, the digestive chaos isn't an occasional visitor, it's a permanent resident with very bad habits and no intention of leaving. Irritable bowel syndrome, or IBS, is a chronic functional disorder of the gastrointestinal tract, characterized by recurring abdominal pain, bloating, and altered bowel habits, which is the clinical way of saying your gut does whatever it wants, whenever it wants, and you're simply living in its house. The diarrhea predominant subtype, known with the quietly ominous abbreviation as IBSD, is the one that sends people to the Imodium aisle with a certain grim familiarity, the way a homeowner learns which floorboards creak. IBS has no single known cause, no cure, and a treatment plan that essentially amounts to figure out your triggers, manage your stress, eat carefully, and keep the bathroom nearby. IBS affects women at roughly twice the rate of men, though researchers are not entirely certain whether this reflects a genuine biological difference, a difference in healthcare-seeking behaviour, or some combination of both. It typically emerges in early adulthood, though it can develop at any age, and it is what physicians call a diagnosis of exclusion, meaning it is diagnosed after other conditions have been ruled out, which requires a process of testing, waiting, and being told that everything looks normal, which is both medically accurate and emotionally unsatisfying when your gut is making your life genuinely difficult. The symptoms of IBSD are not subtle. They include frequent loose or watery stools, often with a sense of urgency that allows very little negotiating time. Abdominal cramping, typically relieved by a bowel movement. Bloating that can be visually obvious and physically uncomfortable. And a pattern of symptoms that waxes and wanes, better for a few days, then worse again, triggered by stress, certain foods, hormonal changes, disrupted sleep, or sometimes nothing identifiable at all. This unpredictability is one of the most exhausting aspects of the condition. You can do everything right, eat carefully, sleep well, manage your stress, and still have a bad day, for no apparent reason, which is demoralizing in a way that is difficult to explain to people whose guts cooperate with them. For many people with IBSD, loperamide becomes a daily management tool, not the emergency 6 tablets before a road trip version, the quieter, routine 1 tablet on difficult mornings version. Used this way, under medical supervision, loperamide has good evidence behind it for managing the diarrhea and urgency of IBSD. It does not treat the underlying condition, it does not reduce the abdominal pain, the bloating, or the visceral hypersensitivity that characterizes IBS. But it manages the most practically disruptive symptom in a way that allows people to go to work, leave the house, attend events, and live something resembling a normal life. The social dimension of IBS is significant and insufficiently discussed. People with moderate to severe IBS often limit their activities, avoid travel, decline social invitations, and make housing and employment decisions based on bathroom proximity. They carry mental maps of public restrooms in every city they visit. They know which restaurants have accessible bathrooms and which do not, which commute routes pass facilities, and which stretch across long, bathroom-free miles. It is a condition that quietly reorganizes a life around a single variable that most people never have to think about. And the Imodium in the bag is not just a medication. It is, for many people, the thing that makes participation in ordinary life possible. There is a specific category of Imodium overconsumption that deserves its own chapter, and it is this: the person who has an unmissable event and a body that has chosen today, of all days, to stage a rebellion. The wedding is in 4 hours, the flight boards in 90 minutes, the presentation is at 9, and it is for the biggest client the company has ever had, and your manager is already in the lobby, and you are currently in the 3rd floor bathroom making promises to every deity you've ever heard of. These are the conditions under which rational people become irrational, not out of recklessness, but out of the very human inability to accept that the body does not consult the calendar. The math people do in these moments is fascinating. If I take this now, how long will it take to work? If I take 2, does it work faster? If I take 4, will I simply never need a bathroom again for the rest of the day? These are not questions with good answers, but they are asked with tremendous sincerity every single day by people wearing uncomfortable formal shoes and holding an Imodium packet like a talisman. The timing question is actually answerable, though the answer is not always what the situation requires. Loperamide typically begins to produce noticeable effects within 1 to 3 hours of taking it. Peak plasma concentration occurs at approximately 2.5 hours. This means that if your flight boards in 45 minutes, the tablet you're taking right now will not save you at the gate. It will save you somewhere over the Atlantic, which is better than nothing but not quite the intervention the moment is calling for. This is useful information that most people do not have when they need it, and so the calculation is made on instinct rather than pharmacokinetics, which is why people sometimes take more than they should in the hope that doubling the dose will somehow halve the time to effect, which it does not. The unmissable event category creates a particular kind of decision-making pressure that strips away the careful, measured approach that works perfectly well in non-urgent circumstances. It is the same mechanism that makes people drive too fast when they are late. Rationally, you know that speeding slightly will not meaningfully change your arrival time. Emotionally, the urgency demands action, and action in this context means pressing the accelerator and hoping for the best. The Imodium equivalent is taking the extra tablet. It feels like doing something. It feels like addressing the problem with appropriate force. And in many cases it works out fine, which is the most dangerous kind of reinforcement. What actually helps, for people who regularly face the wedding flight presentation category of crisis, is building in lead time. Experienced sufferers of anticipatory gut distress know this. Take the loperamide the night before a high-stakes morning, or first thing in the morning of an afternoon event, rather than waiting until the symptoms have already announced themselves at full volume. This approach, used consistently and with an understanding of the drug's mechanism, produces better results than the emergency dose approach, and does not require anyone to make pharmaceutical decisions under conditions of acute panic in a gas station bathroom. But even the best preparation fails sometimes. The gut, as has been established, does not read the calendar, and sometimes the wedding is in 4 hours and the tablet is already in your hand and the only thing left to do is take it, hope for the best, and quietly identify the nearest bathroom in the venue just in case the best does not materialize on schedule. Let's slow down for a moment, which is fittingly exactly what loperamide does. Understanding how this drug actually works makes the whole story considerably more interesting, because it is at its core a story about opioid receptors in a place you might not expect them. Loperamide is a synthetic opioid. Yes, an opioid, the same family of compounds as morphine and codeine, though loperamide is specifically engineered to stay in the gut and not cross the blood-brain barrier at therapeutic doses, which is why it doesn't produce pain relief or sedation, and why it's available without a prescription. It works by binding to mu-opioid receptors in the intestinal wall, which reduces the release of a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. This slows the rhythmic muscular contractions called peristalsis that normally move contents through the gut. It also decreases fluid secretion into the intestine and increases the tone of the anal sphincter, which is not a sentence that appears in many bedtime stories, but is, medically speaking, exactly the point. The result of all this mu receptor binding is a gut that has been told quite firmly and at a molecular level to slow down. Peristalsis, the coordinated muscular waves that move intestinal contents forward, becomes less frequent and less forceful. The intestinal wall absorbs more water from the contents passing through it, because those contents are moving slowly enough that absorption can actually happen, rather than everything rushing past too quickly to be processed. The rectum fills more slowly. The urgency signal, the one that sends you sprinting toward any available bathroom, is delayed and reduced. You have time, not infinite time, but time. This is the entire value proposition of loperamide delivered at the cellular level by a molecule binding to receptors that were originally designed to respond to endogenous opioids your body produces naturally. The blood-brain barrier piece is worth understanding because it explains why loperamide is safe at normal doses when other opioids are not. The blood-brain barrier is a selective filtration system formed by specialized cells lining the brain's blood vessels, which restricts the passage of certain substances from the bloodstream into the brain. Most opioids cross this barrier freely, which is how they produce central nervous system effects including pain relief, sedation, and euphoria. Loperamide is actively prevented from crossing it by a protein called P-glycoprotein, which recognizes loperamide and pumps it back out before it can accumulate in brain tissue. At standard therapeutic doses, this system works perfectly. The molecule stays in the gut. The gut slows down. The brain knows nothing about any of it. The other mechanism worth mentioning is loperamide's effect on intestinal secretion. In diarrheal states, the intestinal lining is often secreting large amounts of fluid into the bowel lumen, the reverse of what should happen, which is the bowel absorbing fluid from contents passing through. Loperamide reduces this abnormal secretion by acting on the mu receptors in the intestinal mucosa, shifting the balance back toward absorption. The fluid stays in your body rather than continuing its urgent and inconvenient journey toward the exit. You rehydrate slightly, the stool firms. The world becomes marginally more manageable. It is an elegant mechanism for a fairly specific problem, targeted, peripheral, and designed with an unusual level of precision for a drug that most people buy without a second thought in the checkout line at a pharmacy. The little white tablet is doing something genuinely sophisticated. Most people, understandably, do not think about this while they're taking it, but the science is there, working quietly, asking nothing in return except that you read the label and respect the recommended dose. 2 requests that the box makes with all the patience and optimism it can muster. For the first 15 or so years of its existence, loperamide was a prescription-only medication, which meant that anyone suffering from acute diarrhea had to somehow arrange a doctor's visit while in the middle of suffering from acute diarrhea, a logistical challenge that, if you think about it for more than a moment, is genuinely cruel. In 1988, the United States Food and Drug Administration approved loperamide for over-the-counter sale, and it quietly became one of the most reliable fixtures in the American medicine cabinet. The transition from prescription to pantry staple is a significant moment in pharmaceutical history because it reflects a broader shift in how regulators and doctors think about patient autonomy and self-care. The recognition that certain conditions are both common enough and manageable enough that people should be trusted to treat themselves, armed with a box, a label, and the general instruction to stop if things get worse. The regulatory pathway for switching a medication from prescription to over-the-counter status is neither quick nor simple. It requires the manufacturer to demonstrate to the FDA that the condition the drug treats is one that consumers can reasonably self-diagnose, that the drug is safe without physician supervision for the indicated use, that the labeling provides sufficient information for appropriate self-management, and that the risks of consumer misuse are acceptable. Loperamide cleared all of these hurdles in 1988 with relative ease. Because acute diarrhea is difficult to misidentify, the drug's safety profile at therapeutic doses is excellent, and the labeling, which had by that point been refined through years of prescription use, was clear and accessible. the switch happened in a broader context of the FDA's efforts through the 1980s and 1990s to move appropriate medications from prescription to over-the-counter status, making healthcare more accessible and reducing the burden on physician offices for conditions that did not genuinely require medical evaluation. Other medications that made similar transitions during this era include ibuprofen, hydrocortisone cream, and certain antihistamines, products that are now so embedded in the routine of everyday self-care that it is difficult to imagine needing a prescription to obtain them. Loperamide belongs in this company. The commercial result was predictable and immediate. Sales increased dramatically as the medication became accessible to anyone who needed it, without the barrier of a medical appointment. The Johnson & Johnson subsidiary marketing Imodium in the United States invested in consumer advertising that positioned the product not as a serious pharmaceutical intervention, but as a practical tool for managing the ordinary disruptions of daily life, the travel, the stress, the occasional meal that didn't quite agree with you. It became, in the public imagination, a household staple on the level of aspirin and antacids, something you kept in the cabinet not because you expected to need it, but because the alternative was finding out you needed it at a moment when you couldn't get it. This normalization has been almost entirely positive. It means that hundreds of millions of people manage a common, self-limiting condition effectively at home without unnecessarily consuming healthcare resources. It means that travellers carry appropriate preparation for one of travel's most predictable inconveniences. It means that the box is there, the instructions are clear, and for the vast majority of people, the story ends neatly. The tablet works, the symptoms resolve, and life continues exactly as planned. The pantry staple earns its place on the shelf, one unremarkable recovery at a time. There are certain environments that represent the perfect storm of conditions for digestive distress: unfamiliar food, unpredictable water, disrupted sleep, elevated stress, communal facilities, and a schedule that does not accommodate inconvenient biological emergencies. Camping trips, music festivals, and cruise ships are three of the most famous. The camping context is perhaps the most elemental. You are eating food that has been transported in a cooler for hours, cooked over an open flame with variable results, and your nearest bathroom is a hole in the ground that you share with everyone else at the campsite. Music festivals add the dimension of porta potties in the July heat, food trucks of uncertain pedigree, and the kind of dehydration that makes the gut particularly unstable. Cruise ships are their own remarkable category, because the combination of motion sickness, buffet meals eaten 3 times a day, recirculated air, and the closed-loop nature of a ship at sea means that when a gastrointestinal illness spreads on a cruise, it spreads with a breathtaking efficiency that public health officials study with what can only be described as horrified admiration. Let's start with camping, because camping represents the most honest version of what human beings are doing when they leave behind the infrastructure of modern sanitation and pretend for a weekend that this is fine. The cooler that has been loaded into the back of the car since Thursday morning and opened 15 times before you reach the campsite is not maintaining the temperature it was maintaining when you left home. The chicken that seemed adequately cooked over the fire was cooked on the outside with conviction, and on the inside with considerably less certainty. The water from the stream that looked perfectly clear was upstream, sharing space with wildlife whose sanitary habits do not align with public health recommendations. All of this is the camping experience, beloved by millions, and accompanied by a gastrointestinal risk profile that experienced campers manage with a combination of preparation, cooler discipline, water treatment tablets, and a strategic relationship with the camp bathroom that begins on arrival and continues until departure. Music festivals deserve their own public health study, and in fact several exist. The combination of factors at a large outdoor music festival is almost comically hostile to digestive stability. Temperatures in summer are high. Porta potties, of which there are never quite enough, become progressively less sanitary as the festival progresses. Food vendors operate at scale under conditions that make consistent temperature control challenging. The crowd is large, close together, and sharing surfaces, fences, barriers, drink stations, with a promiscuity that any infectious pathogen would find enormously convenient. Norovirus outbreaks at music festivals are documented and recurring events. The festival experience is wonderful, and the gastrointestinal risk is real, and the people who pack Imodium alongside their sunscreen and rain jacket are not overcautious. They are experienced. Cruise ships are the most medically fascinating of the three environments because of their closed-loop nature. Once a ship is at sea, it is a self-contained ecosystem. The passengers who boarded it brought their microbes with them, and those microbes circulate in a space where food is prepared for thousands of people simultaneously, where surfaces are touched by everyone, and where the ventilation systems recirculate air throughout the ship. The CDC's Vessel Sanitation Program inspects cruise ships and publishes outbreak data, and the reports make for instructive reading. Norovirus in particular finds cruise ships extraordinarily hospitable, and outbreaks affecting dozens to hundreds of passengers in a single voyage are not unusual. The buffet, it turns out, is not just a caloric hazard, it is an epidemiological one. In all three environments, the practical wisdom is the same. Prepare, be cautious about food and water, stay hydrated, wash your hands with a frequency that other people will find slightly unusual, and carry the Imodium. Not because disaster is inevitable, because when it arrives, it will arrive on the second day of a 5-day camping trip, in the middle of the headline act, or somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and the nearest pharmacy will be nowhere near close enough. If you want to understand the full spectrum of the Imodium experience, you could do worse than spend an afternoon behind the pharmacy counter, which is a place that sees humanity in its most honest form. Not the curated, put-together version of people, the version that shows up at restaurants and offices and social media profiles. The pharmacy sees people who are tired, slightly embarrassed, in various degrees of discomfort, and holding a product they were not expecting to need today. Pharmacists are among the most accessible healthcare professionals in most countries, and the questions they feel about loperamide are revealing in their specificity. Can I take this with my other medication? I've already had 4 today. Is that okay? My kid is 6. Is the children's version strong enough? I have a long drive tomorrow, and then a meaningful pause, as if the rest of the sentence is self-explanatory, which it is. The pharmacist's answer is almost always the same. Follow the label, stay hydrated, see a doctor if it lasts more than 2 days, and please, for your own sake, do not take more than the recommended dose. Pharmacists occupy an unusual position in the healthcare system. They are clinically trained, deeply knowledgeable about drug interactions, contraindications, and mechanisms of action, and they are available without an appointment, without a copay for the consultation, and without the 15-minute wait in a room full of other sick people that characterizes most physician visits. In many countries, they are the first and sometimes only healthcare professional a person consults for common acute illnesses, including gastroenteritis. Their guidance is evidence-based and practically valuable, and it is available to anyone who walks through the door and asks. The drug interaction question is one pharmacists take seriously with loperamide, because it exists and matters. Loperamide is metabolized by the liver enzyme system CYP3A4 and transported by P-glycoprotein, meaning that drugs which inhibit either of these, including certain antibiotics like clarithromycin, some antifungals and various cardiac medications, can increase the plasma concentration of loperamide significantly. This is not a trivial interaction. Higher than expected loperamide concentrations increase the risk of cardiac effects, particularly QT prolongation. A pharmacist reviewing a medication list before recommending loperamide is doing something genuinely useful, not performing bureaucratic caution. The combination of loperamide with drugs that affect its metabolism is one of the documented pathways to the cardiac complications associated with the medication, even at doses that might otherwise seem moderate. The hydration conversation is the one pharmacists have most consistently, and which patients hear least attentively, because the urgency of stopping the diarrhea tends to dominate the cognitive space that dehydration management should be occupying. The pharmacist who recommends oral rehydration salts alongside loperamide is offering a complete treatment package. Manage the symptom with one product. Replace what the symptom has already taken with the other. Both matter. The loperamide gets the credit because its effect is felt. The oral rehydration salts prevent the complications that develop quietly in the background, while the primary drama is being managed. There is also, behind the pharmacy counter, a particular kind of professional patience that deserves acknowledgement. The pharmacist who has answered the same loperamide questions 300 times answers them a 301st time with the same accuracy and the same absence of judgment, because the person asking does not know they are the 301st. They are embarrassed, uncomfortable, and trying to solve a problem with the tools available to them. The pharmacy counter is one of the few places where that person gets practical, expert help without having to explain themselves or justify why they didn't see a doctor. That access matters, quietly and consistently, every single day. Here is something that gets lost in the scramble for the Imodium box, the planning of emergency bathroom routes, and the existential negotiation with one's own digestive system. Diarrhea causes dehydration, and dehydration is the part that can actually make you seriously ill. The fluid losses from acute diarrhea are substantial. The gut is secreting water into the intestine faster than the body can absorb it, and each trip to the bathroom takes with it not just water, but electrolytes, sodium, potassium, chloride, bicarbonate. These are not optional. Sodium and potassium regulate nerve function, muscle contractions including the heart, and the fluid balance of every cell in the body. When they drop significantly, things go wrong in ways that are considerably more alarming than the original problem. Children and elderly adults are particularly vulnerable, which is why oral rehydration therapy, a simple solution of water, sugar and salt, is considered one of the most important public health interventions in medical history, estimated to have saved tens of millions of lives globally since its widespread adoption. The volume of fluid lost during a significant episode of diarrhea is genuinely startling when quantified. A single loose stool can contain anywhere from 200 to several hundred millilitres of fluid. Multiply that by multiple episodes over a few hours and you're talking about a litre or more of fluid, leaving the body through a route that bypasses the normal absorption mechanisms entirely. The gut is not recovering this fluid. The kidneys are compensating as best they can, concentrating urine and conserving water, but they can only do so much. If you're not actively replacing what is being lost, the deficit accumulates quickly. The symptoms of dehydration progress in a predictable and uncomfortable direction. Mild dehydration, loss of roughly 1 to 2% of body weight in fluid, produces thirst, dry mouth, and slightly reduced urine output. Moderate dehydration, 3 to 5%, brings headache, dizziness, reduced urine output, and a general malaise that compounds the misery of the underlying illness. Severe dehydration, greater than 5%, can cause rapid heartbeat, low blood pressure, confusion, and in extreme cases, organ damage. Most healthy adults with acute gastroenteritis do not reach severe dehydration if they are drinking fluids, but they also often underestimate how much they need to drink. because the act of drinking when your gut is in revolt feels counterintuitive, and because the thirst mechanism is not a reliable early warning system. Oral rehydration therapy works because it exploits a specific mechanism in the intestinal wall called sodium-glucose cotransport. Even when the gut is secreting fluid and in significant distress, this transporter continues to function, actively pulling sodium and glucose from the intestinal contents into the intestinal cells and dragging water along with them. A solution containing the right balance of sodium, glucose, and water, approximately 90 millimoles of sodium per litre, with a glucose concentration around 2%, is absorbed more efficiently than plain water, faster than sports drinks, and far more effectively than the soda or juice that many people reach for instinctively. The specific formula matters. A WHO oral rehydration solution contains sodium, potassium, chloride, citrate, and glucose in precise proportions that have been refined through decades of research and field application. Commercial oral rehydration products like Pedialyte approximate this formula for consumer use. The honest, slightly uncomfortable truth is that for many episodes of acute diarrhea in otherwise healthy adults, oral rehydration therapy is actually the most important treatment, more important than loperamide, more important than dietary changes, and considerably more important than the various folk remedies and gut rest approaches that circulate in popular advice. Stopping the diarrhea with loperamide feels productive. Replacing electrolytes with a packet of oral rehydration salts feels less dramatic. And yet the second intervention is doing more of the work that actually protects your health. The little packet deserves considerably more credit than it receives, sitting there quietly next to the green box that gets all the attention. For most of its history, Imodium was one of the most boring drugs in the medicine cabinet, effective, safe, widely available, and generating approximately zero controversy. Then, sometime around 2015 and 2016, something changed. Reports began emerging in medical literature and poison control data of people taking loperamide in doses that were not just above the recommended level but dramatically, dangerously above it, dozens of tablets at a time, sometimes more. The reason, in most documented cases, was the same. People in opioid withdrawal, or people dependent on opioids who could not access other substances, had discovered that at extremely high doses, loperamide can cross the blood-brain barrier in sufficient quantities to produce opioid-like effects. The blood-brain barrier is not a wall, it is a selective filter, and loperamide is designed to be blocked by a protein called P-glycoprotein at the gut level. But at very high doses, that system can be overwhelmed. This was not a recreational discovery made by curious chemists. It was a discovery made by desperate people in a desperate situation, which is the context that matters enormously when understanding what followed. The pharmacological basis is real and has been understood in theory since loperamide was first synthesized. Paul Janssen and his team knew they were working with an opioid compound and specifically engineered the P-glycoprotein susceptibility to prevent central nervous system penetration. At therapeutic doses 2 to 8 milligrams per day, this engineering works perfectly. At the doses appearing in the case reports 60, 100, 200 milligrams per day, sometimes more, taken over days or weeks, the P-glycoprotein efflux pump is simply overwhelmed by the volume of substrate it's trying to manage, and loperamide begins accumulating in brain tissue in concentration sufficient to produce opioid receptor activation in the central nervous system. The online communities where this information circulated in the early 2010s described loperamide as a legal, cheap, accessible substitute for prescription opioids or heroin, available on every pharmacy shelf, purchasable without a prescription, and in large enough packages to accumulate the doses needed for effect. People shared dosing information, onset times, and strategies for managing the cardiac side effects they were already experiencing, which is perhaps the most sobering detail in the entire story. People were aware of the cardiac risk, were experiencing symptoms of cardiac abnormality, and were continuing to use the drug because the alternative, opioid withdrawal with no treatment access, felt worse. The medical literature response was swift once the pattern became visible. Case reports of loperamide-associated cardiac arrhythmia began appearing in cardiology and emergency medicine journals in significant numbers. The FDA issued safety communications in 2016, warning about the risk of serious cardiac events, including QT prolongation and ventricular arrhythmia, associated with higher than recommended doses. Poison control centers reported significant increases in loperamide-related calls, and in 2018 the FDA required new packaging limits, no more than 48 milligrams per package for over-the-counter products, specifically to reduce the ability to accumulate large quantities in a single purchase. The packaging restriction was a reasonable response to a documented harm, and it almost certainly reduced some of the most extreme high-dose use. But it did not address the underlying driver, inadequate access to addiction treatment, and people determined to obtain large quantities of loperamide could and did purchase multiple packages. The story of loperamide's moment in the medical headlines is not really a story about a dangerous over-the-counter drug. It is a story about what happens when people in genuine medical crisis have no accessible, affordable, destigmatized treatment available to them, and improvise with whatever the pharmacy shelf offers. The drug did not change. The circumstances around it did. The reason the high-dose loperamide situation became a genuine medical concern was not mild discomfort or even a bad trip. It was cardiac arrhythmia. The heart, it turns out, has opioid receptors of its own, and at sufficiently high doses of loperamide the drug can interfere with the electrical conduction system that keeps the heartbeat regular and coordinated. Specifically, extremely high doses can cause QT prolongation and abnormality in the timing of the heart's electrical cycle that can, in severe cases, trigger a life-threatening irregular rhythm called torsades de pointes. This is not a side effect that appears in the everyday Imodium story. It is a consequence of doses many times the recommended maximum, often taken repeatedly over days or weeks, by people who are not taking it for digestive reasons at all. Between 2010 and 2016, the United States Food and Drug Administration received hundreds of reports of serious cardiac events associated with high-dose loperamide misuse, including several deaths. To understand why QT prolongation is dangerous, it helps to understand a small amount of cardiac electrophysiology. The heart beats because of coordinated electrical impulses that travel through specialized conduction tissue, triggering the sequential contraction of chambers that constitutes a heartbeat. The QT interval, measured on an electrocardiogram, represents the time from the beginning of ventricular depolarization to the end of ventricular repolarization, essentially the time the heart's electrical system takes to reset between beats. Normal QT intervals fall within a specific range. When the QT interval is prolonged beyond that range, the heart is vulnerable during the repolarization phase to abnormal electrical activity, specifically to the development of a rhythm called torsades de pointes, which is French for twisting of the points and refers to the distinctive appearance of the arrhythmia on an electrocardiogram. Torsades de pointes can be self-terminating, producing a brief episode of palpitations, lightheadedness, or near fainting before the heart returns to normal rhythm. Or it can degenerate into ventricular fibrillation, the chaotic, uncoordinated electrical activity in which the heart quivers uselessly rather than pumping blood, which is fatal within minutes without defibrillation. This is the outcome that the case reports associated with high-dose loperamide describe. people presenting to emergency departments with life-threatening arrhythmias, some of whom did not survive, in whom no other explanation for the cardiac event was found, and in whom loperamide concentrations were measured at levels many times higher than therapeutic range. The mechanism involves loperamide's inhibition of cardiac ion channels, specifically the HERG potassium channel, which plays a critical role in repolarization. This is actually a recognized liability of many drugs that are carefully screened for it during pharmaceutical development. Loperamide's HERG channel activity is minimal at therapeutic concentrations and is not a clinical concern at normal doses. At the concentrations achieved through extreme overdose, concentrations Paul Janssen never intended his molecule to reach in cardiac tissue, the HERG inhibition becomes significant enough to produce measurable QT prolongation. The practical implication for ordinary users is reassuring. At the doses on the box, this does not happen. The cardiac risk of loperamide at therapeutic doses is not meaningfully different from placebo. The entire concern exists in a dose range that is so far outside normal use that it requires deliberate, sustained and extreme consumption to reach. But the story matters because it illustrates something important about the relationship between dose and safety that applies to almost every medication. The difference between a medicine and a poison is, in the most literal pharmacological sense, the dose. The green box is safe at the dose on the label. The label is there for a reason. To understand why anyone would take enough Imodium to trigger a cardiac event, you have to understand the landscape of opioid addiction and withdrawal in the United States and beyond during the first 2 decades of the 21st century. Opioid withdrawal is not merely uncomfortable, it is a physically agonizing experience involving severe cramping, nausea, vomiting, muscle pain, insomnia, anxiety, and an overwhelming compulsion to make the suffering stop by any means available. People in withdrawal, particularly those without access to medication-assisted treatment like buprenorphine or methadone, whether because of cost, availability, stigma, or legal barriers, are people in genuine medical crisis looking for any relief. Loperamide became a documented last resort not because people were ignorant of the risks, but because the risks of withdrawal felt more immediate and more unbearable. The opioid crisis in the United States reached a scale that is difficult to fully absorb. From the late 1990s through the 2010s, prescription opioid misuse, heroin use, and then synthetic opioid, particularly fentanyl, overdoses produced a wave of addiction and death that affected millions of families across every demographic. At its peak, overdose deaths exceeded 70,000 per year in the United States alone. Behind those numbers were people who had often become dependent through legitimate pain treatment, through social circumstances, or through the kind of gradual escalation that is a feature of opioid pharmacology and is not a moral failing, however much the public conversation around addiction has historically treated it as one. Medication-assisted treatment, buprenorphine and methadone in particular, is the evidence-based standard of care for opioid use disorder. Both medications reduce cravings, prevent withdrawal, and dramatically decrease the risk of overdose death. The data on their effectiveness is robust and consistent. And yet, for much of the period when the opioid crisis was at its worst, access to these treatments was severely limited. Buprenorphine required a specially licensed prescriber, and the number of licensed prescribers was insufficient to meet demand. Methadone for opioid use disorder could only be dispensed through licensed clinics, which were geographically concentrated, had limited hours, and required daily attendance that was incompatible with employment and family responsibilities. The cost, the stigma, the legal complexity, and the sheer logistical difficulty of accessing treatment meant that many people who needed it could not get it, and they were left to manage withdrawal as best they could. In this context, loperamide's opioid mechanism was not a secret. It was known, discussed online, and acted upon by people who were trying to survive a situation that the healthcare system was not adequately equipped to address. The accessibility and low cost of loperamide, available at any pharmacy, no prescription required, affordable on almost any budget, made it uniquely available in a landscape where the appropriate treatments were not. This is the uncomfortable arithmetic of the situation. The drug that was on the shelf was loperamide, and it had partial opioid activity at high doses, and people in opioid withdrawal used it, and some of them developed cardiac arrhythmias, and some of those people died. Every link in that chain connects back to a treatment access gap that packaging restrictions on loperamide did not and could not address. It is worth saying clearly, the people who used loperamide this way were not reckless thrill seekers. They were people with a medical condition, trying to manage a medical crisis, using the only tool they could reach. The appropriate response to their situation was better access to addiction medicine. The response they got, too often, was a smaller box of Imodium at the pharmacy. History will not be generous to that gap. Children and Imodium have a complicated relationship, because the pediatric gut is a different instrument than the adult one. More sensitive, faster to dehydrate, and more responsive to medications in ways that make standard dosing guidelines much more conservative. Children's loperamide formulations exist and are approved for children aged 6 and older in most countries, at significantly reduced doses calculated by body weight. For children under 6, loperamide is generally not recommended at all, not because it is uniquely toxic to young children, but because the dehydration and electrolyte loss of diarrhea in that age group are the primary dangers, and the correct response is almost always oral rehydration rather than slowing the gut. A toddler with diarrhea does not need the gut slowed. The toddler needs fluids replaced, and doing so while also stopping the fluid loss can actually mask how seriously dehydrated the child is becoming, delaying appropriate treatment. The physiology of childhood diarrhea is worth understanding because it explains why the pediatric approach differs so substantially from the adult one. Children have a higher surface area to body weight ratio than adults, which means they lose fluid proportionally faster through the gut during diarrheal illness. A fluid loss that would produce mild dehydration in an adult can produce significant dehydration in a toddler in a much shorter time frame. The kidneys in young children are also less efficient at conserving water and electrolytes than adult kidneys, meaning the compensatory mechanisms available to adults work less effectively in the very young. Add to this the fact that young children cannot reliably communicate how they are feeling, and the clinical picture of dehydration can develop and worsen before caregivers fully recognize what is happening. Oral rehydration therapy is the cornerstone of management for childhood diarrhea globally, and its effectiveness has been demonstrated across decades and continents with a consistency that few medical interventions can match. The WHO and UNICEF have jointly promoted oral rehydration therapy since the 1970s, and its widespread adoption in developing countries is credited with preventing millions of childhood deaths from dehydration due to diarrheal disease. In high-income countries, the same principle applies, though the urgency is often lower because access to medical care is available if oral rehydration is insufficient. The paediatrician's guidance is consistent. For children under 6 with diarrhea, offer an oral rehydration solution, monitor hydration status, and seek medical attention if the child is not taking fluids, is showing signs of significant dehydration, has blood in the stool, has a high fever, or is not improving after 24 hours. For children between 6 and 12, the children's formulation of loperamide is available at weight-appropriate doses and can be appropriate for acute, uncomplicated diarrhea in otherwise healthy children after other causes have been considered. The dosing is conservative, typically 1 milligram after the first loose stool and 1 milligram after each subsequent loose stool, with maximums that are a fraction of the adult limit, and the same principle applies as in adults, not for use with blood in the stool, fever, or signs of serious infection. Read the label, follow the weight chart. When in doubt, call the paediatrician, who will almost certainly tell you the same thing the label does, but with a reassuring tone that makes the whole situation feel slightly more manageable. The pink box, in other words, is not just the green box with a different colour scheme. It represents a genuinely different clinical approach to the same symptom in a genuinely different physiological context, developed with appropriate caution and appropriate conservatism, because children are not small adults. They are different patients, and they deserve different rules. There is a corner of the sporting world where gastrointestinal distress is so common, so anticipated, and so strategically managed that athletes discuss it with the same pragmatic matter-of-factness that they discuss training schedules and nutrition plans. Distance running, in particular, is famous for this. The term runner's trots exists for a reason, and that reason is that somewhere between 30 and 50% of distance runners experience gastrointestinal symptoms during training or competition, with diarrhea being among the most common. The causes are multiple and overlapping: the mechanical jostling of the gut during running, reduced blood flow to the intestines as blood is diverted to working muscles, the pre-race anxiety response discussed earlier, and the gels and drinks consumed for energy, which can be osmotically active enough to draw fluid into the gut. The mechanical component is one of the more straightforwardly logical contributors. Running is, at a basic physical level, a repetitive vertical impact activity. Each footfall sends a jolt through the body that the gut, suspended in the abdominal cavity, feels directly. This jostling accelerates gut motility in a way that cycling, swimming and rowing, non-impact sports, do not, which is why gastrointestinal symptoms are considerably more common in runners than in other endurance athletes. The gut is, in effect, being shaken continuously for 2, 3, 4 or more hours, and it responds to this in predictable ways. The blood flow redistribution is the second major contributor. During intense aerobic exercise, cardiac output is preferentially directed to working skeletal muscles and away from organs that are not immediately essential to the exercise being performed. The gastrointestinal tract, not being primarily responsible for generating the power required to run 26 miles, receives significantly reduced blood flow during distance running, sometimes as little as 20% of its resting blood supply during maximal effort. This ischemia, reduced oxygen delivery to the intestinal tissue, damages the intestinal lining, increases permeability, and promotes the kind of secretory activity that produces loose, urgent stool at precisely the moment when stopping to address it is least convenient. The nutrition piece adds another layer. Sports gels, chews, and drinks used during endurance events typically contain concentrated carbohydrates, often fructose and glucose in combinations that are efficiently absorbed under normal conditions, but can overwhelm the intestinal transport systems when the gut is already ischemic and mechanically stressed. Fructose in particular is notorious for causing osmotic diarrhea when consumed in excess of the gut's absorptive capacity, which during a hard effort is lower than it would be at rest. Athletes who have managed their race nutrition for years still occasionally misjudge the balance and pay the price somewhere around mile 18. In this context, some endurance athletes use loperamide prophylactically, taking a low dose before a long run or race to reduce gut motility preemptively and decrease the likelihood of mid-race emergency. Sports medicine physicians approach this practice with caution for several reasons. Slowing the gut during intense exercise in hot conditions may impair the body's ability to regulate temperature, since gut blood flow also contributes to heat dissipation. Reduced gut motility may cause cramping and bloating in some athletes, and the underlying causes of exercise-induced gastrointestinal distress are better addressed through training adaptations, nutrition management, and pre-race gut protocols than through pharmacological suppression. But athletes who have tried everything else, who are facing an event they have trained months for, and who know from experience that their gut will otherwise derail their race, those athletes are going to make their own calculation. And they frequently do. There is an entire category of human experience defined by the absence of convenient bathrooms, and perhaps no profession understands this more viscerally than long-haul truck drivers, who navigate routes that can span hundreds of miles between rest stops, who operate vehicles that cannot simply be pulled over on the shoulder because the biological timeline has become inconvenient, and who carry in their cab the same fundamental pharmacopoeia of survival that long-distance travellers everywhere have assembled: water, electrolyte tablets, antacids, and somewhere in there, a packet of Imodium, because hope is not a plan but preparedness is. The logistics of digestive management on the open road are genuinely complicated. Rest stops are spaced miles apart on major interstates, further on rural routes, and in some parts of the country you can drive significant stretches where the only option is a gas station bathroom that has not been cleaned since the previous administration. Long-haul trucking is a profession with a health profile that reflects the cumulative consequences of an unconventional lifestyle. Drivers work irregular hours, sleep in their cabs, eat at truck stops and fast food chains along the route, and spend the majority of their working hours sedentary, in a position that is not ergonomically kind to the digestive system. Sitting for prolonged periods slows gut transit. The mechanical assistance that walking and movement provide to intestinal motility is absent, which means that constipation is actually a more common chronic complaint among truck drivers than diarrhea. But when diarrhea does arrive, it arrives in a context where the normal human response, excuse yourself, find a bathroom, wait it out, is not straightforwardly available, and this creates a specific practical urgency that makes loperamide not a comfort item, but a professional necessity. The diet available on a long-haul route is not optimized for gastrointestinal stability. Truck stop food is calorie-dense, often high in fat, frequently fried, and sometimes of uncertain freshness, in the way that food sold at volume in high-traffic locations sometimes is. Fast food consumed on the go lacks the dietary fibre that supports healthy gut function. Irregular meal timing disrupts the gut's circadian rhythm. Yes, the gut has a circadian rhythm, and it functions best when meals arrive at consistent, predictable times, and the absence of that consistency contributes to the digestive unpredictability that experienced drivers manage with a combination of dietary discipline and pharmaceutical backup. The rest stop question is worth dwelling on for a moment, because the distribution of rest stops on American highways is not uniform, and the quality of available facilities is not consistent. Major interstate rest areas are spaced roughly every 30 to 50 miles in most states, which sounds adequate until you're in a state of urgent biological need, and the last sign indicated 32 miles to the next facility. Truck stops, which are more frequent and more comprehensively equipped, are a better resource. They have bathrooms, they have parking appropriate for large vehicles, and they have the Imodium in the convenience store if you somehow didn't bring any. The experienced driver knows the truck stop locations the way a sailor knows the coastline, not because they are thinking about it consciously, but because the knowledge has accumulated through experience and become part of the professional mental map. All of which is to say that the loperamide in the truck cab glove compartment is not an indulgence. It is a tool kept alongside the logbook and the spare fuses for managing a specific and foreseeable professional challenge. It represents the same practical wisdom that characterizes good logistics planning in any context. Identify the risk, prepare for it, have the contingency ready before you need it. The road is long, the rest stops are finite, and the Imodium is there. Before we return to the medicine cabinet context that most of us occupy, it is worth stepping back to the larger picture, because diarrheal disease is not just an inconvenience. Globally, it is one of the leading causes of death, particularly among children under 5 in low-income countries. The World Health Organization estimates that diarrheal disease kills approximately 1.5 million children each year, a number that sits at the intersection of contaminated water, inadequate sanitation, limited access to oral rehydration therapy, and healthcare systems stretched beyond their capacity. In this global context, loperamide is actually on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines recommended specifically for management of acute diarrhea when appropriate, particularly in adults and older children, where oral rehydration therapy alone is insufficient to manage symptoms. The contrast between the high-income context, where Imodium is the thing you grab on the way to a work conference, and the low-income context, where it is a carefully rationed medical resource, is a useful reminder that the same molecule can occupy very different places in very different worlds. The global burden of diarrheal disease is concentrated in regions without reliable access to safe drinking water and adequate sanitation infrastructure. Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia account for the majority of diarrhea-associated child deaths, and the underlying causes are primarily environmental. Water sources contaminated by human and animal waste, open defecation practices that return pathogens to the soil and water supply, inadequate hand-washing facilities, and food storage and preparation conditions that allow bacterial growth. These are not problems that loperamide can solve, because loperamide does not address contamination, does not treat infection, and does not replace the fluids lost to dehydration. It manages symptoms in people who are already sick. The interventions that address the root causes are infrastructure and sanitation, the construction of clean water systems, sewage treatment, and hand-washing facilities that wealthy countries completed generations ago, and which billions of people around the world still lack. The progress that has been made, however, is real and significant. Child mortality from diarrheal disease has declined dramatically over the past 3 decades, by approximately 60% since 1990, according to WHO data. As oral rehydration therapy has become more widely available, as vaccination against rotavirus has been introduced in many countries, as zinc supplementation has been incorporated into diarrhea treatment protocols for children, and as improvements in water and sanitation infrastructure have reached more communities. This progress represents one of the genuine achievements of global public health. Millions of children alive today who would not have been alive in an earlier era because of unglamorous, logistically demanding, politically unremarkable work, delivering oral rehydration salts and clean water to places that needed them. Rotavirus vaccination deserves particular mention because it represents a targeted biological intervention against one of the most significant causes of severe diarrheal disease in children under 2. Rotavirus causes hundreds of thousands of child deaths annually, almost entirely in low-income countries, and it is essentially vaccine preventable. 2 oral vaccines, Rotarix and Rotatec, have been available since the mid-2000s and have been incorporated into the childhood immunization schedules of a growing number of countries with WHO support. Where they have been deployed, the reduction in severe rotavirus gastroenteritis and associated mortality has been dramatic. So the global picture of diarrheal disease is simultaneously a story of ongoing tragedy, the children still dying from preventable dehydration, and of genuine progress, driven by the kind of practical, unsexy public health work that rarely makes headlines but saves lives continuously. The Imodium in your cabinet and the oral rehydration sachet in a community health worker's bag in rural Kenya are both part of the same pharmacological story. separated by context, infrastructure, and the accident of geography that determines so much about the medical options available to any individual human being on this planet. There is a population of people for whom the Imodium story begins not with a bad meal or an anxious morning, but with a medical procedure. The colonoscopy. Colonoscopy preparation involves a bowel cleanse that is, to put it gently, thorough, a process that evacuates the entire contents of the large intestine in preparation for the camera examination, using laxative solutions that many patients describe as among the more memorable experiences of their adult lives. The procedure itself is brief and painless. The preparation is neither. In the days following a colonoscopy, the gut is often unsettled, slow to return to normal motility, and occasionally prone to cramping and loose stool as it restores its normal bacterial population and fluid balance. Loperamide occasionally makes an appearance in the post-colonoscopy period, sometimes recommended by physicians to help manage the transition back to normal function. It is, in this context, the digestive equivalent of a soft landing, the pharmacological signal to the gut that the emergency is over. Normal operations can resume, and there is no need to continue running on high alert. The colonoscopy preparation itself deserves a moment of acknowledgement, because it is one of the more dramatic experiences that routine preventive medicine asks people to undergo, and the fact that millions of people do it every year reflects a genuine commitment to health that deserves more credit than it typically receives. The standard bowel preparation involves drinking a large volume of a laxative solution, typically 1 to 4 litres, depending on the preparation used, over the course of an evening, which triggers the complete emptying of the large intestine over a period of several hours. The experience is not subtle. It is thorough, immediate, and entirely consuming of one's evening plans, whatever those plans may have been. The morning after the procedure, once the colonoscopy itself is complete and the sedation has worn off, patients often find themselves in an interesting physiological state. The large intestine, which has been thoroughly evacuated, is essentially empty and mildly irritated from the preparation and the procedure. The gut's normal bacterial population, the microbiome that was quietly managing fluid absorption and fermentation, and a dozen other functions before the preparation began, has been significantly disrupted. The coordinated muscular activity of the colon, which had been running at full speed for hours the previous day, is now uncertain about what to do next. The result for many people is a period of loose stools and unpredictable urgency in the days following the procedure, as the gut works its way back to baseline. Post-colonoscopy dietary guidance typically recommends starting with soft, easily digestible foods, crackers, toast, applesauce, broth, before returning to a normal diet over 1 to 2 days. This is the gut's equivalent of relearning to walk after an extended rest. Some physicians recommend or permit a dose of loperamide in the first day or two following the procedure for patients experiencing significant post-procedural diarrhea, particularly if the colonoscopy involved biopsies or polypectomy, which can leave small areas of the intestinal lining mildly inflamed. In this context, loperamide is being used not to suppress a defensive response to infection, but to smooth the transition back to normal function in a gut that has been through an unusual experience and needs a little pharmaceutical encouragement to settle down. The broader lesson of the post-colonoscopy experience is one that applies throughout the Imodium story. The gut is a resilient organ, capable of returning to normal function after significant disruption, but it does so on its own timeline and with its own particular brand of drama along the way. Giving it appropriate support, rest, gentle reintroduction of food, adequate hydration, and occasionally a tablet of loperamide to ease the transition respects that timeline without fighting it. The soft landing is not an admission of defeat. It is good management of a temporarily disrupted system, which is all that loperamide, used appropriately, ever really is. For patients undergoing chemotherapy, diarrhea is one of the most common and debilitating side effects, not a mild inconvenience, but a treatment-limiting complication that can require dose reductions, treatment delays, or hospitalization. Certain chemotherapy agents, particularly those that target rapidly dividing cells, cause significant damage to the cells lining the gastrointestinal tract, which are among the fastest dividing cells in the body. The resulting intestinal mucositis can cause severe, profuse diarrhea that goes far beyond anything the average Imodium narrative contemplates. In oncology, loperamide is frequently used, often at doses higher than standard over-the-counter guidance, under physician supervision as part of a structured management protocol. The National Comprehensive Cancer Network, the American Society of Clinical Oncology, and other major medical bodies publish guidelines for managing chemotherapy-induced diarrhea that specifically include loperamide as a first-line agent. In this context, taking more than the standard dose is not recklessness. It is a medically supervised response to a genuinely serious complication of cancer treatment. The intestinal lining is one of the most actively dividing tissues in the human body, renewing itself completely approximately every 3 to 5 days under normal conditions. This rapid turnover is essential. It maintains the integrity of the barrier between the gut contents and the bloodstream, ensures efficient nutrient absorption, and allows the intestine to recover quickly from the normal wear of its daily work. It also makes the intestinal lining exquisitely sensitive to chemotherapy agents that work by targeting rapidly dividing cells, which cannot distinguish between the cancer cells they are intended to kill and the intestinal epithelial cells that happen to share the property of dividing quickly. The damage to the intestinal epithelium from chemotherapy has a predictable pattern. It typically begins within a few days of treatment, peaks in the first 1 to 2 weeks of a treatment cycle, and recovers between cycles as the intestinal lining regenerates. During the peak damage phase, the intestinal barrier is compromised, fluid secretion is increased, and absorption is reduced, producing diarrhea that can be watery, frequent, and in severe cases, significant enough to cause dangerous dehydration and electrolyte disturbances. Grade 3 and 4 chemotherapy-induced diarrhea, the severe and life-threatening categories on the standard oncology toxicity scale, can result in hospitalization for intravenous fluid replacement and electrolyte correction, and may require dose modification of the chemotherapy regimen, which directly affects treatment efficacy. The oncology loperamide protocol looks different from the over-the-counter guidance on the green box. Standard management for mild to moderate chemotherapy-induced diarrhea typically begins with 4 mg of loperamide at the first loose stool, followed by 2 mg every 4 hours or after every loose stool, up to a maximum of 16 mg per day, twice the standard over-the-counter maximum for up to 24 to 48 hours. If symptoms do not respond, patients are instructed to contact their oncology team for escalation, which may include different pharmacological agents or intravenous management. This higher dose ceiling is appropriate in a supervised clinical context because oncologists are monitoring patients for complications, adjusting treatment as needed, and providing the kind of oversight that makes higher dose use safe in ways that unsupervised over-the-counter use is not. The experience of managing chemotherapy-induced diarrhea is one that cancer patients and their caregivers navigate with a combination of clinical guidance, practical experience, and the specific kind of resilience that oncology demands. It is not glamorous, it is not discussed at cocktail parties, and it is one of the less visible dimensions of cancer treatment that significantly affects quality of life. Loperamide, in this context, is not the emergency backstop in a road trip kit. It is a frontline clinical tool managing a serious complication of life-saving treatment, doing its quiet work in one of medicine's more difficult arenas. It deserves to be understood that way. At some point, maybe hours later, maybe the next day, maybe after what feels like an unreasonably long period of negotiation, the storm passes. The gut, having exhausted itself or expelled whatever it was trying to expel or simply run out of urgency, quiets down. The cramping eases. The trips to the bathroom become less frequent. There is a tentative, almost suspicious return to something resembling baseline function, and you find yourself eating a piece of dry toast and thinking cautiously that things might be okay. This transitional period has its own complications. After a bout of significant diarrhea, the intestinal lining is often mildly inflamed and irritated, and the gut's microbial population, the trillions of bacteria that constitute the gut microbiome and play essential roles in digestion, immune function, and overall health, has been somewhat disrupted. The body's return to normal function is not instantaneous. It is a gradual recalibration that can take anywhere from a few hours to several days, during which certain foods remain inadvisable, certain activities remain optimistic, and the bathroom retains a significance in daily planning that it does not typically possess. The post-illness dietary progression is one of the more practically useful pieces of medical guidance that exists, and also one of the most commonly ignored, because once the acute symptoms resolve, the temptation to return immediately to normal eating is powerful and almost universally acted upon. The traditional brat diet, bananas, rice, applesauce, toast, was the standard dietary recommendation for post-diarrhea recovery for decades, and while it has been partially superseded by guidance emphasizing early return to normal diet for most patients, the underlying logic remains sound. These foods are low in fiber, easily digestible, and gentle on an intestinal lining that has just been through a significant stress event. They do not demand much from a gut that is still recalibrating. The foods that are inadvisable in the immediate post-illness period are, predictably, the ones that demand the most from an intestinal system that is not yet operating at full capacity. High-fat foods slow gastric emptying and can trigger the gastrocolic reflex, the signal from the stomach to the colon that food has arrived and the colon should prepare to move things along, more forcefully than the recovering gut can comfortably manage. High-fiber foods, while beneficial for healthy gut function over the long term, introduce more fermentable substrate than the reduced bacterial population of a post-diarrhea gut is ready to process efficiently and can produce gas, bloating, and cramping. Dairy in the immediate post-illness period is sometimes temporarily problematic even for people who are not lactose intolerant, because diarrheal illness can transiently reduce the production of lactase, the enzyme that digests lactose, in the intestinal cells that are still recovering from damage. The microbiome recovery piece is the one that takes longest and is least visible. Studies examining the gut microbiome before and after acute gastroenteritis find that the microbial community is meaningfully disrupted, reduced in diversity, altered in composition, and that full recovery can take days to weeks, depending on the severity of the illness, the pathogen involved, and whether antibiotics were used. Probiotics are frequently recommended for the post-illness period, and while the evidence for specific probiotic strains in accelerating microbiome recovery is mixed and strain-specific, the general principle of supporting the rebuilding of a healthy microbial community through fermented foods, dietary fiber and prebiotic-rich foods is well-founded. The return to normal, in other words, is a process rather than a moment. The gut does not flip a switch. It negotiates its way back cautiously, incrementally, with occasional setbacks, toward the quiet, efficient function that you didn't notice when it was happening, because that is the whole point of a well-functioning gut. You only notice it when it stops, and when it starts again, that first normal day, no cramping, no urgency, no mental mapping of bathroom locations, is quietly, genuinely wonderful. in a way that is difficult to appreciate unless you have recently spent time without it. There is a particular type of person, and you may recognize yourself in this description, or you may recognize someone you love who does not merely own one box of Imodium but maintains what can only be described as a strategic reserve. 3 boxes in the medicine cabinet, 1 in the car, 1 in the work bag, a travel packet in every piece of luggage they own. This is not recklessness. This is the behaviour of someone who has been caught without Imodium at a critical moment and has decided with quiet and total certainty that this will never happen again. The psychology of medical preparedness is genuinely interesting. For people who have experienced significant gastrointestinal illness, whether as a one-time event or as a chronic condition, the anxiety about recurrence can itself become a management challenge. The presence of Imodium nearby is reassuring in a way that is partly rational and partly placebo. Knowing the option exists reduces the catastrophizing that often makes stress-related gut symptoms worse. The origin story of the Imodium hoarder is almost always the same. There was a moment, a specific, unforgettable, deeply motivating moment, when the need was acute and the Imodium was not there. Maybe it was the international flight where the symptoms began at cruising altitude with 7 hours remaining, and the overhead bin containing the bag containing the medicine cabinet was occupied by other people's luggage. Maybe it was the important dinner where the entree turned out to be an optimistic choice, and the restaurant's bathroom was a single-occupancy closet with a queue. Maybe it was simply the Sunday morning when the pharmacy was closed, and the nearest open option was 40 minutes away, and every minute of that 40 minutes was a negotiation with the body. Whatever the inciting incident, the result is the same. A person who will never again be caught without the tablet, in any situation, under any circumstances, because the cost of that unpreparedness was too high and too memorable. The psychology here touches on something broader than Imodium specifically, the relationship between anxiety, control, and preparedness in health management. People with health anxiety and people who have experienced serious or frightening illness often develop preparedness behaviours that serve a dual function. They provide genuine practical readiness for a recurrence, and they provide psychological containment of the anxiety about that recurrence. Carrying the medication is a form of control in a domain where control is limited. The body does what it does. You cannot fully prevent the next episode, but you can ensure that when it comes, you will not be without resources. That agency, small, practical, tangible, reduces the sense of helplessness that health anxiety often produces. The safety behaviour dimension is worth examining with some nuance, because not all preparedness behaviours are equal in their psychological effects. Carrying Imodium in your bag is almost entirely benign. The medication is safe to carry, inexpensive, and does not expire quickly, and the preparedness it represents does not meaningfully constrain your life or require significant accommodation. It is a reasonable response to a real risk. Where preparedness behaviours become worth examining more carefully is when they begin organising life around the avoidance of the feared situation, declining social invitations because a bathroom might not be accessible, choosing housing based on proximity to a gastroenterologist, refusing travel because the gut cannot be trusted at distance. These behaviours, in their more extreme forms, represent IBS-related anxiety that has expanded beyond its original functional purpose and is limiting life in ways that merit professional support. The 3 boxes in the medicine cabinet, the packet in the car, the travel stash in every bag, for most people, this is simply good logistics. It is the medical equivalent of keeping an umbrella in the car. You may not need it today, you will need it eventually, and when you do, the quiet satisfaction of reaching into the bag and finding the green box exactly where you knew it would be is one of the small, reliable pleasures of a life well organised against uncertainty. let's end where all good gut stories end, with a moment of genuine appreciation for the organ that has been the subject of this entire somewhat undignified evening. The human gastrointestinal tract is, by almost any measure, a marvel. 25 feet of specialised tissue, beginning at your mouth and ending, well, you know where it ends, processing everything you eat, extracting nutrients, managing fluid, communicating with the immune system, housing trillions of microorganisms, and doing all of this continuously, automatically, and largely, without asking for your input or your gratitude. It gets things wrong sometimes. It overreacts. It is susceptible to infection, stress, poor food choices, disrupted sleep, and 100 other variables that modern life provides in abundance. And when it does overreact, it does so loudly, urgently, and with impressive single-mindedness. But most of the time, the vast majority of the time, it simply works. Quietly, relentlessly, without acknowledgement. The scale of what the gut processes over a lifetime is genuinely staggering when you sit with the numbers. The average person consumes approximately 1,000 to 2,000 pounds of food per year. Over a 70-year adult life, that is somewhere between 70,000 and 140,000 pounds of food, passing through a system that has been running continuously since before birth, without a service interval, without replacement parts, and with only the most basic maintenance. The food you eat, the water you drink, the sleep you get. The intestinal lining renews itself completely every 3 to 5 days, replacing itself more frequently than almost any other tissue in the body, maintaining its integrity against an environment that is, when you think about it, extraordinarily hostile, acidic, enzymatic, populated by trillions of microorganisms and in constant mechanical motion. The immune function that the gut performs is largely invisible but essential. Approximately 70% of the body's immune cells reside in or around the gastrointestinal tract, a fact that reflects the gut's position as the primary interface between the external world and the internal body. Everything you eat introduces foreign material, proteins, carbohydrates, microbial fragments, environmental contaminants. The gut's immune system must evaluate all of it continuously, distinguishing between harmless food antigens that should be tolerated, beneficial microbial components that should be welcomed, and genuine pathogens that should be attacked. This discrimination, the difference between a tolerant immune response and an inflammatory one, is calibrated over years of exposure, shaped by the microbiome, and responsible for the difference between a gut that functions normally and one that develops food sensitivities, inflammatory conditions, or chronic dysregulation. The enteric nervous system, the 500 million nerve cells woven through the gut wall, runs this entire operation with a level of autonomy that earns the brain analogy it has been given. It coordinates peristalsis, regulates secretion and absorption, monitors the chemical composition of gut contents, communicates with the immune system, and maintains a constant dialogue with the brain via the vagus nerve. It does all of this in the background below the level of conscious awareness 24 hours a day without requiring your attention or your direction. You are, in a meaningful sense, not running your gut at all. Your gut is running itself, and doing an extraordinary job of it, and only occasionally during the events that are the subject of this script, drawing your attention to the fact that it exists at all. So tonight, settling into whatever comfortable position your clean bed and your cooperative gut allow, give it a quiet moment of acknowledgement. Not for the dramatic nights, for all the ordinary ones. Every unremarkable meal that was processed without incident. Every trip that was taken without pharmaceutical intervention. Every Tuesday that passed in complete digestive silence, which is the highest form of gastrointestinal complement. The gut asks very little and gives very much. and the Imodium in the cabinet is simply the backup plan for the rare occasions when the arrangement requires renegotiation. Deep inside your intestinal tract, in conditions that would make most science fiction writers blush with envy, lives an ecosystem so vast, so complex, and so consequential to your health that scientists have spent the last 2 decades trying to fully understand it, and have, so far, mostly succeeded in discovering how much they still don't know. The human gut microbiome, the collective community of bacteria, viruses, fungi and other microorganisms inhabiting your digestive tract, contains somewhere in the neighbourhood of 38 trillion microbial cells, which means that on a cellular level, you're approximately as much microbe as you are human. This is either fascinating or deeply unsettling depending on your philosophical disposition at this hour of the evening. These microorganisms are not passengers. They are active participants in digestion, synthesizing vitamins your body cannot produce on its own, training the immune system to distinguish between threats and non-threats, producing neurotransmitters that communicate with the brain, and maintaining the integrity of the intestinal lining that keeps gut contents where they belong. The composition of the gut microbiome is unique to each individual, more distinctive in some measures than a fingerprint. It is shaped by birth mode, with babies born vaginally acquiring their initial microbial communities from the birth canal, while babies born by caesarean section acquire theirs from skin and environmental sources, producing a different initial composition with effects that researchers are still mapping. It is shaped by breastfeeding versus formula feeding in infancy. It is shaped by diet throughout life, the diversity of plants you eat, the fibre content of your meals, the fermented foods you consume or avoid. It is shaped by every course of antibiotics you have ever taken, every illness you have survived, every environment you have lived in. By the time you reach adulthood, your microbiome is a biographical record of your life, written in microbial populations, and it is influencing your health in ways that extend well beyond digestion. The connection between the gut microbiome and diarrheal illness is direct and bidirectional. On one hand, a healthy and diverse microbiome provides what microbiologists call colonization resistance, the ability of the established microbial community to resist invasion by pathogenic organisms that would otherwise take hold and cause illness. A dense, diverse community of beneficial bacteria occupies the intestinal real estate, competes for nutrients, produces antimicrobial compounds, and maintains conditions that are inhospitable to pathogens. On the other hand, diarrheal illness, whether infectious or otherwise, disrupts the microbiome, reducing its diversity and altering its composition in ways that transiently reduce this protective function, and can, in some cases, create openings for secondary infections. Loperamide, by slowing gut transit, affects the environment in which the microbiome lives. A slower moving gut exposes its contents to the intestinal lining for longer, changes the fermentation dynamics in the large intestine, and alters the oxygen tension and pH of different gut segments in ways that favour different microbial populations. Whether this effect is beneficial, neutral or harmful depends on the circumstances, the reason the gut was moving fast in the first place, the duration of loperamide use, and the underlying state of the microbiome going in. For short-term use in acute uncomplicated diarrhea, the effect is unlikely to be meaningfully negative. For longer-term use in chronic conditions, microbiome effects are one of many factors that physicians managing these conditions monitor and consider. The honest summary is that the microbiome story is still being written. The research is genuine, the findings are compelling, and the clinical applications are still catching up to the science. What is clear is that the 38 trillion organisms sharing your intestinal tract are doing important work on your behalf, that they are sensitive to the same disruptions that affect you, and that the tablet you take to manage an acute crisis is operating inside a living ecosystem far more complex than the box gives any indication of. Respect for that complexity is, perhaps, the most sophisticated thing you can bring to the medicine cabinet. There is a dimension to the Imodium story that rarely gets discussed openly, which is appropriate given what the dimension involves, but which matters enormously in terms of public health and personal well-being: the embarrassment. Digestive illness is funny in retrospect, relatable in the abstract, and genuinely mortifying in the immediate present. This social shame surrounding bowel function is deeply embedded in most cultures, and it has real consequences. It causes people to delay seeking medical care for symptoms that have been present for weeks or months, to underreport symptoms to their doctors, to manage conditions quietly and privately, when professional guidance would help enormously, and to suffer through situations that didn't need to be suffered through. Studies on irritable bowel syndrome consistently find that patients wait an average of several years between the onset of symptoms and receiving a diagnosis, not primarily because the condition is difficult to identify, but because people spend years assuming what they are experiencing is normal, or too embarrassing to mention, or something they should simply manage on their own. The cultural prohibition on discussing bowel function is so thoroughly internalized that most people have never had a direct, unembarrassed conversation about it with anyone, not their partner, not their friends, not their doctor. Think about the vocabulary available for discussing digestive illness in social settings. It is almost exclusively euphemistic, comedic, or clinical, with very little space for honest, neutral description of a common human experience. You can say you have a stomach bug, which is vague and inoffensive. You can make a self-deprecating joke, which discharges the tension through humour. You can use clinical terminology, which creates enough professional distance to be bearable. What is socially very difficult is simply saying, "I have diarrhea. It has been happening for 3 days, and I am not sure what to do about it." That sentence, accurate and reasonable, feels almost unsayable in most social contexts, which is remarkable given that the experience it describes affects virtually everyone. The consequences of this silence are medical as well as social. Colorectal cancer, one of the most common and most preventable cancers, has diarrhea, changes in bowel habits, and rectal bleeding among its warning signs, symptoms that people frequently delay reporting because they are embarrassed, because they assume there is a simpler explanation, or because they do not want to be the person who went to the doctor about their bowel movements. The median time between onset of colorectal cancer symptoms and diagnosis is several months. An embarrassment-related delay is a documented contributing factor. Earlier diagnosis dramatically improves outcomes in colorectal cancer. The reluctance to discuss bowel symptoms has a measurable cost in survival. The doctor's office is, theoretically, the one place where the embarrassment should be manageable, because physicians are trained to discuss all aspects of bodily function without judgment and with appropriate clinical seriousness. In practice, the consultation time constraints of modern primary care, the power dynamic of the clinical encounter, and the patient's own discomfort often conspire to produce a conversation in which the bowel symptoms are mentioned briefly, minimized, or not mentioned at all. Patients who have been managing chronic diarrhea for years sometimes report that they mentioned it to their doctor only in passing, or that the doctor seemed busy in the moment past, or that they convinced themselves it wasn't worth bringing up. These are not failures of medicine. They are failures of the social context around medicine, produced by a culture that has decided inexplicably to treat one of the most universal human experiences as unspeakable. The Imodium purchase, made quietly, tucked into the shopping basket under other items, paid for without eye contact, this is the physical expression of that silence. It is practical, it is understandable, and it is part of a broader pattern that occasionally allows manageable conditions to become serious ones, simply because nobody wanted to say the word. Antibiotics are one of the genuine triumphs of modern medicine, compounds that have saved hundreds of millions of lives since their discovery, and that remain, despite the growing challenge of resistance, among the most important tools in the medical arsenal. They are also, from the gut's perspective, a significant disruption event. Antibiotics do not distinguish between the bacteria causing your infection and the bacteria living peacefully in your intestinal ecosystem, minding their own business and performing essential services. They kill indiscriminately, and the collateral damage to the microbiome can be substantial. Antibiotic-associated diarrhea occurs in somewhere between 5 and 35% of people taking antibiotics, depending on the specific drug, the dose, the duration, and the individual's microbiome going in. The mechanism is straightforward. Remove enough of the gut's normal bacterial population, and you destabilize the ecosystem, alter fluid and electrolyte handling in the colon, and create conditions that favour opportunistic organisms. The antibiotic most notorious for causing diarrhea is clindamycin, followed closely by ampicillin, amoxicillin clavulanate, and the cephalosporins, all broad-spectrum agents that hit the gut microbiome with considerable force. Fluoroquinolones, macrolides and tetracyclines are moderately disruptive. Narrower spectrum antibiotics that target specific organisms while sparing more of the gut flora tend to be gentler on the microbiome, which is one of many reasons that the principle of using the most targeted antibiotic appropriate for the identified infection, rather than defaulting to broad-spectrum coverage, matters not just for antibiotic resistance but for individual patient comfort and recovery. The diarrhea associated with antibiotic use typically begins within a few days of starting the course, though it can develop up to several weeks after completion, in cases involving Clostridioides difficile. Simple antibiotic-associated diarrhea, the kind caused by microbiome disruption without specific pathogen overgrowth, usually resolves within a week or two of completing the antibiotic course, as the gut's bacterial community begins to recover. During this period, loperamide can be appropriate for managing symptoms in adults, with the important caveat that it should not be used if the diarrhea is severe, if there is blood in the stool, or if C. difficile is a possibility. Clostridioides difficile deserves specific mention because it represents the most serious complication of antibiotic-associated gut disruption. C. difficile is a spore-forming bacterium that exists in low levels in the intestinal tracts of some healthy people without causing illness, held in check by the competing microbial community. When antibiotics disrupt that community, C. difficile can overgrow and produce toxins that cause significant intestinal inflammation, a condition ranging from mild diarrhea to severe colitis that can be life-threatening. Loperamide is specifically contraindicated in C. difficile infection because slowing the gut allows the toxins produced by the organism to remain in contact with the intestinal lining for longer, worsening the inflammation and potentially contributing to a serious complication called toxic megacolon. The treatment for C. difficile is specific antibiotics targeting the organism itself, vancomycin or fidaxomicin, and the principle of treatment is the opposite of loperamide. Let the gut move, expel the toxins, and treat the infection directly. The post-antibiotic gut eventually recovers, but the recovery is not always complete or fast. Studies tracking microbiome composition after antibiotic courses find that some species that were disrupted never fully return to their pre-antibiotic levels, and that the diversity of the community can remain reduced for months. This is one of the biological costs of antibiotic use that is invisible but real, and it is one of many reasons that the principle of not taking antibiotics when they are not needed, not for viral infections, not prophylactically without indication, is important not just for population-level resistance management, but for the long-term health of your own particular gut ecosystem. Somewhere right now, in an airport terminal, a university examination hall, or a paediatrician's waiting room, a person is sitting very still and concentrating very hard on not concentrating on their stomach. The nervous flyer who boards every flight with a queasy certainty that today will be the day something goes wrong. The university student who has spent 3 weeks preparing for a final exam and whose gut has decided with impressive timing that exam morning is the appropriate moment to stage a full revolt. The parent in the paediatrician's waiting room who has been awake since 4 and whose anxiety about their child has migrated, as anxiety tends to, directly into their abdomen. These are not people with gastrointestinal disease. These are people with functional gut responses to psychological stress, the ancient and persistent connection between what the brain perceives and what the gut expresses, translated into modern inconvenience. For many of them, the Imodium in the bag is less medication than talisman, the physical presence of a contingency plan that reduces anxiety enough to reduce the gut symptoms that the anxiety was causing in the first place. The nervous flyer's experience is worth examining in some detail because it layers multiple anxiety mechanisms on top of each other in a confined and inescapable space. Flying involves a loss of control that is psychologically significant for many people. You are at altitude in a pressurized tube, entirely dependent on systems and personnel you cannot assess or influence. This loss of control activates the stress response in susceptible individuals, which activates the gut, which produces cramping and urgency, which increases anxiety about the situation, which intensifies the gut response. It is a feedback loop that escalates efficiently and is very difficult to interrupt once it is running. The fact that airplane bathrooms are small, shared, sometimes occupied, and occasionally inaccessible during turbulence or takeoff and landing adds a practical dimension to the anxiety that makes the whole cycle worse. The nervous flyer does not just worry about flying. They worry about the bathroom on the flight, which is a more specific and more practically manageable worry, and the one that the Imodium is actually addressing. The examination context is equally well documented in the stress physiology literature. Academic performance anxiety is associated with a specific and consistent pattern of physical symptoms: elevated heart rate, dry mouth, trembling, and gastrointestinal distress that represents the fight or flight response being triggered by the perception of threat that an examination represents. Students who have never had gastrointestinal symptoms in any other context sometimes find that exam mornings reliably produce them, which is disorienting and demoralizing, and not particularly well addressed by the existing advice to breathe deeply and think positive thoughts. The gut does not respond to positive thinking. It responds to autonomic nervous system signals that are, in the short term, not fully under voluntary control. The worried parent deserves specific acknowledgement because parental anxiety has a physiological as well as psychological dimension that is often under-recognized. The stress of having an unwell child, the vigilance, the disrupted sleep, the sustained low-level alarm state that parenting a sick child produces activates the same stress response that any other sustained threat perception produces, and the gut feels it. The parent in the waiting room is not imagining their symptoms. They're experiencing a real physiological response to a real psychological stressor in a body that is doing exactly what it was designed to do at a moment when the design is not serving them particularly well. For all three, the flyer, the student, the parent, the most effective long-term management is not pharmaceutical. It is addressing the anxiety itself through cognitive behavioral approaches, stress management techniques, and where appropriate, professional psychological support. But in the immediate term, on the morning of the exam, at the departure gate, in the waiting room, the tablet in the bag is doing real work, managing a real symptom, and buying the space needed to get through the moment. sometimes that is exactly what is needed, and exactly enough. The Imodium box tells you the maximum dose. It tells you not to use it for more than 2 days without consulting a doctor. It uses clear, reasonable language that most people read once, absorb partially, and then set aside in favour of their own assessment of how serious the situation actually is. But there are moments, and they matter, when diarrhea is not a problem to be managed with an over-the-counter anti-diarrheal and a quiet hope that it passes, but a symptom pointing to something that deserves medical attention. The wedding is in 4 hours, the flight board's in 90 minutes, the presentation is at 9. These are the moments that drove you to the Imodium. But there are other moments, quieter, less dramatic, sometimes easy to rationalise away, when the right move is not another tablet but a phone call, a clinic visit, a conversation with someone who can examine you and determine what is actually happening. The red flag symptoms for diarrhea are specific, evidence-based, and worth knowing so thoroughly that they are retrievable under conditions of some cognitive distraction, which is the condition under which they are most frequently needed. Blood in the stool, bright red, dark, or the sticky black stool called melena, that indicates bleeding higher in the gastrointestinal tract, is never a symptom to manage at home with loperamide and hope. Blood in the stool requires medical evaluation, because the differential diagnosis includes conditions ranging from hemorrhoids, which are common and benign, to inflammatory bowel disease, to colorectal malignancy, none of which benefit from being managed symptomatically while the underlying cause continues undiscovered. Fever accompanying diarrhea suggests an infectious cause significant enough to have produced a systemic immune response. The body is fighting something, and what it is fighting may need to be identified and treated specifically, rather than suppressed with an anti-diarrheal. A temperature above 102 degrees Fahrenheit, or any fever in a very young child or elderly person with diarrhea, is a signal to seek care. Severe abdominal pain, not the cramping and urgency that normally accompany acute diarrhea, but a more localized, intense or constant pain, suggests involvement of structures beyond the intestinal lumen and warrants evaluation. Symptoms lasting more than 2 days in an adult, or more than 24 hours in a young child without improvement, deserve a medical conversation. Signs of significant dehydration are the other category of alarm, and they are worth enumerating because they are sometimes missed until they are advanced. Extreme thirst, dry mouth, decreased or absent urination, dark concentrated urine, dizziness on standing, rapid heartbeat, and in severe cases confusion. These represent a fluid deficit that oral rehydration at home may not be sufficient to address, particularly in older adults whose thirst mechanism is less reliable, and in young children whose reserves are smaller. Intravenous fluid replacement in a medical setting is appropriate and effective for significant dehydration, and it is considerably more straightforward than the complications that develop if dehydration is allowed to progress. The 2-day rule on the box is not arbitrary. It reflects a genuine clinical reality. The vast majority of uncomplicated acute diarrhea in healthy adults resolves within 48 to 72 hours without specific treatment. Diarrhea that persists beyond this window without improvement is more likely to have a cause that warrants identification: persistent bacterial infection, parasitic infection, early presentation of inflammatory bowel disease, medication effect, or one of the other conditions that can present as chronic or recurrent diarrhea, and that benefit from diagnosis and specific management rather than ongoing anti-diarrheal use. The body is usually trying to tell you something when it makes this much noise. Most of the time, what it is telling you is temporary and manageable, and the green box is exactly the right response. But sometimes it is asking you to listen more carefully, and the willingness to hear the difference, to notice when the situation has moved from inconvenient to concerning, and to act on that recognition rather than taking one more tablet and hoping the box was right all along, is, in the end, the most important thing in the cabinet. Not the medication, the judgment about when to use it, and when to put it down and make the call. Here is the outro. And so, here we are. At the end of a long, surprisingly educational, and occasionally undignified journey through one of the most universal human experiences in the history of human experiencing. You have travelled through buffets of questionable wisdom and street food of extraordinary courage. You have met the nervous flyer, the anxious student, the long-haul driver with his glove compartment pharmacy, and the chemotherapy patient managing something far more serious than an inconvenient Tuesday. You have visited the ancient gut, with its 500 million nerve cells and its 38 trillion microbial tenants, all doing their quiet, relentless work on your behalf, largely without your knowledge and entirely without your thanks. You have learned that the little green box is, in most circumstances, exactly what it claims to be: a practical, well-designed, genuinely useful tool for managing one of life's more unpleasant surprises. And you have learned that it is also, in the wrong circumstances, a window into something much larger: addiction, healthcare access, anxiety, the invisible suffering of chronic illness, and the profound human tendency to solve urgent problems with whatever is reachable on the nearest shelf. The people in tonight's story, all of them, the tourist who ate the wrong thing on the first day of the trip, the runner who misjudged the gel intake at mile 15, the person in opioid withdrawal who had nowhere else to turn, the cancer patient managing treatment side effects with quiet stoicism, the parent who has memorized the location of every public bathroom within a 10-mile radius of their house. All of them were doing the same fundamental thing. They were trying to get through the day, to function, to show up for the thing that needed showing up for, with a body that was, in that moment, making it considerably more difficult than it needed to be. There is something quietly remarkable about that, about the human insistence on continuing, on planning the road trip and boarding the flight and sitting the exam and attending the wedding and doing the treatment and going to work, in spite of the body's occasional and very vocal objections. It is not glamorous. It does not make the highlight reel. Nobody posts about it. But it happens every single day, in pharmacies and bathrooms and gas stations and examination halls all over the world, and it is, in its own thoroughly unglamorous way, a form of resilience. So tonight, as you settle into your clean bed, in your temperature-controlled room, with your indoor plumbing and your reliable water supply, and your medicine cabinet containing the appropriate backup for whatever tomorrow's gut may decide to do, maybe take a quiet moment for all of it, for the infrastructure you don't notice, for the body that mostly works, for the 38 trillion microorganisms holding down the fort while you sleep, and for the small, reliable, slightly overused green box that has, on more occasions than you might care to count, made the difference between missing the thing and making it. Sleep well, stay hydrated, and you already know where the Imodium is.